Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Eileen Espiritu on Arctic sustainability. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studio here at the Center for International Governance Innovation to talk about some important issue of global governance, international public policy, international affairs. And today, my guest is Eileen Espiritu, who's director of the Barents Institute at the University of Tromsø in northern Norway. So yes. Welcome for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Arctic sustainability, two topics that are dear to Canadians' hearts, and it'll be interesting to hear what you have to teach us about these from your perspective in northern Norway, which of course is much further north than most of Canadians. We tend to forget that although Canada is an Arctic country, most Canadians live very far south compared to where you live. Let's begin a bit with some background on you and also on the Barents Institute, which I imagine most of our viewers don't know a great deal about yet.
Yes, although I'm living in Norway now, I am Canadian. And my research has been on indigenous populations in Russia and the impact of industrial development on their communities and on their lives. And so having now moved to Norway, what I've been doing is taking that experience and taking that knowledge and using that as a framework for looking at indigenous populations in northern Norway, but also non-indigenous communities, because unlike the Canadian North, the Norwegian North is both indigenous and non-indigenous. I live on the 70th parallel, and we have universities and colleges up there, and most of the people who live in the Norwegian North are non-indigenous. But there's definitely a strong indigenous element as well.
What's the proportion between indigenous and non-indigenous?
That's a really good question. I think it's just like the Canadian scene. It's about, at least in the larger context of Norway, I guess it's a little bit bigger.
But relatively evenly split, actually up in the far north, I guess.
Yeah. Well, no.
Nope, still maintains the same proportion?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think it's because much like the Canadian North, a lot of indigenous, or at least the provincial north in Canada, a lot of indigenous populations or peoples are moving to the south to go to school, to work, and things like that. And it's the same in Norway. Right. So you see a large Sami population living in Oslo in the south, whereas they've come from the north.
And what's the mandate of the Barents Institute?
We have two. We are located 14 kilometers from the Russian border, again on the 70th parallel. And so we have two research foci. And the first is borders and border issues, and that's very salient at the moment in an expanding EU. So what we're doing is comparative studies of borderlands from the Barents region all the way to the Mediterranean. And there are aspects of northernness or nordicity in that context, but the other research foci that we do, is the Arctic. High North is what it's called in the Norwegian political scene, because as you might know, Norway goes even further north in Svalbard, so that's what is called the real Arctic, the high Arctic in Norway, whereas on the 70th parallel, we're just high north.
I see. So, you have a background also in Russian studies.
That's right.
Comparative politics, I suppose.
Exactly.
And
yes.
Are there lots of similarities between sort of Russian high north Arctic sustainability issues and, say, Scandinavian or Canadian, or are these rather different stories that have to be understood in different ways?
They have to be understood in different ways. I think Norwegians and Canadians can agree fairly much on definitions of sustainability, but it's much harder in the Russian context, mainly because the Russian high north is very, very industrialized, and that's how Russia built itself as a nation, and so especially during the Soviet period, and so sustainability is even really, really difficult to translate from sustainable development, for example, from English to Russian. There's just not a term, not an understood term. So that's an incredibly difficult concept to even engage with Russian policymakers. Not so much with Russian academics and researchers, however. They understand what sustainable development might mean. But in a sense, it makes it difficult to engage, because the policymakers have a fairly strong hold on what researchers cannot do still within the
In
Russian
Russia.
context. They're the funders for the most part.
And the Russian policymakers are overwhelmingly focused on economic growth. And
Exactly, especially in the high north, especially when it comes to resource development, oil and gas development. Oil and gas is the backbone of Russian economy, of the legitimacy of the Russian state. And apart from that, of course, there are minerals mining going on just across the way. Again, 14 kilometers from us is already Russia, but 35 kilometers from the town that our institute is located is a nickel smelter. And so there's nickel mining in the region. A little further on, there are diamonds, and then, of course, there's oil and gas as we move towards the Siberian fields in West Siberia.
And quite a long history of very severe environmental pollution.
Yes,
in Russia.
And as you may know, this is how the Arctic Council actually emerged through the creation of the Arctic Environmental Protection Agency or policy. In that there was a fear by the Nordic countries, both Norway and Finland, that all of this pollution was coming from Russia, and so they needed to engage with Russia on mitigating some of those environmental pollution.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot to talk about. We'll be back again in a moment with Eileen Espiritu. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So you're particularly interested in community sustainability, and
Indeed,
I think
yes.
I know what the sustainability part is like, but what specifically is community sustainability in your mind, and what are the specific kind of issues that we need to understand better in order to achieve it?
That's a very good question. The reason why I wanted to talk about Arctic sustainability with you today is because we have this fairly large project that involves partners from the US, Canada, Russia, of course, and Finland, and us at the IMARES Institute in Norway. And what we're looking at is sort of defining what sustainability means in the Arctic. And what we're finding is that the Arctic is actually not as rural as people think it is. It's very, very urban in some places, especially in Russia. So what we're looking at is, in fact, Arctic urban sustainability. And so that means that some of the questions that we're asking is, how are policymakers changing their views or policies around climate change, about permafrost melting and things like that, and how are they keeping communities together, keeping them from leaving the north because of climate change, because of lack of infrastructure and things like that. And also, how do you keep communities intact when industry falls apart because of economic crisis and things like that. So those are the kinds of sustainability questions that we're asking, both environmental, and economic. So that's what we mean by community sustainability. And very much like the Canadian North, there's a great deal of depopulation, or maybe not so much because there's still natural increase in the Canadian North. But in the Norwegian and the Russian North, the depopulation is acute. You see an out-migration of youth, especially. This cohort from about 20 to 30 is basically
moving to the big cities.
Yes, exactly. Of course, that's the time when they're going to school, they're getting jobs, but they're not. The problem is they're not coming back. Our neighbor to the east, in Russia, for example, Murmansk used to be 500,000 people. Now, I think it's less than 300,000, and that's just over. Drop. Yes, that's just over the last 15 years because of deindustrialization, because of course the breakup of the Soviet Union, things like that. And we're also looking at climate migration, whether that's having an impact. And it's certainly infrastructural problems are part of that.
Right. And when people think about climate change, they immediately assume that means that the Arctic will be more accessible and will be more hospitable and so on and so forth. I've heard other people say that actually Scandinavia and the Russian far north on the west side are probably, according to some models, likely to get even colder because the Gulf Stream will weaken.
Yes, and more snow.
More ice, less hospitable. I guess that uncertainty makes it very difficult to to plan and to project what's needed to promote sustainability in the long term.
That's true. Well, it doesn't keep developers away, though. There's just still massive interest in developing the high north, in both Norway and Russia, and I know in Canada as well. So for some reason,
developing for oil and gas extraction.
That's right.
Mining.
Mining is huge. It's becoming a very, very huge issue now in the Nordic countries. Finland in particular, and Sweden and Norway. Norway has not been historically a mining country. Having said that, the town that our institute is in, Kirkenes, is a mining town, but it lags behind the other two Nordic countries, Finland and Sweden, in terms of mining. But it has just invested 100 million crowns in order to map the minerals, what's underneath the ground in northern Norway. And so that means that the state itself wants these mining operations to develop eventually, as obviously as development of resources in the
What's
high
the
north.
state of environmental standards in the region? Are they more or less consistent across countries, or?
It's pretty high in the Nordic countries. It's not so much in Russia. It's still a matter of who you know in Russia and the networks that you have, whether you have to go through rigorous environmental assessments and things like that. So it's actually quite ad hoc in Russia. Some parts are very good, and some parts are not. And so it's difficult to say. Although, again, as you may know, in Russia it might be written down as very, very rigorous, but in practice, that's where it falls apart a bit.
Are there requirements finessible, or is there a lot of corruption?
There is.
In Russia.
There's a lot of corruption. And there's very, very little community consultation, whether that's indigenous or not indigenous. So, having said that, it's in the Norwegian case, just as a comparative example, the environmental standards are very high, very rigorous, but they haven't yet, unlike the Canadian example, they don't have yet this practice of consulting indigenous populations. And so now the indigenous populations are looking to the Canadian example and saying, wait a second, Canadian indigenous peoples are being consulted very rigorously in terms of community involvement in mining operations, for example. How come we are not? So the Norwegians are having to deal with that, having to negotiate that.
And why are they not? Is it because they're mixed in with the non-indigenous populations?
That could be the case, but it's also because Norway feels that it has enough of a very rigorous environmental protection policy that it doesn't need that kind of voice. And so if you're consulting indigenous peoples, it's actually it's not a common thing. It's anomalous. And so there's one copper mining company or a startup operation that wants to mine in this part of northern Norway that is traditionally Sami, and they've been very good at consulting the Sami parliament, the Sami population, and that's sort of been seen by especially the Sami as a model of how to do it. Does not necessarily mean they're going to be able to mine, but they're going through the consultative process.
What about in Russia? Do indigenous populations get consulted in Russia?
No. That's a bit more of a tricky situation, and it's just not. The culture isn't there for that, and so it's not done on a regular basis. If it's done on an ad hoc basis. And depending on the company as well, whether they want to engage with the local population, and so it's very uneven throughout the country.
Oh, fascinating. Yes. We'll be back again in a moment with Eileen Espiritu. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So it sounds like Russia's sort of the odd person out here on the Arctic Council, and it makes me wonder about a range of things, and we'll get to the governance implications of that in a minute. But staying on the subject of indigenous communities, there must be some kind of tension within indigenous communities about how they would like to see things unfold and how they understand sustainability. And you will know more than I do, but I imagine there's some generational differences, there's different levels of attachment to traditional ways of life, different levels of attachment to traditional languages.
Yes, definitely.
How do these internal debates, I suppose, within these communities play out when it comes to trying to figure out what community sustainability actually means?
Yeah, of course, what we'll need to do with our project is do deep interviews with Indigenous peoples. But at the moment, in terms of what we've found so far, of course, it's also very different from the Nordic countries, which are fairly similar in terms of how they deal with the Sami indigenous population, and of course the Russian north, which is much wider, much more vast, and many more indigenous peoples. And it also depends on what resources are present in the so-called indigenous traditional territories, although the Russians are not willing to acknowledge that they are indigenous traditional territories. They tried to do that in the early Putin days, the late Yeltsin days, but it hasn't, those laws, even though they were met very positively, those laws just have not been enacted. Or ratified, unfortunately.
Because they specified land use rights or something?
That's right.
Oh, I see.
Yes,
right.
yes, traditional territorial rights for indigenous peoples in Russia. And so
prohibiting economic development by outsiders.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Well, Russian outside, non-indigenous outsiders. So oil and gas companies, for example, which are for the most part Russian government owned, and so it's quite uneven in that respect in terms of how sustainability is defined. Having said that, I think indigenous populations, we sort of have this idea of indigenous populations as monolithic in their views, and as you have just brought up, that's not the case. There are a multiplicity of views and multiplicity of interests across the north, and even among indigenous communities. For example, we call them the Sami. They range. They live in 4 countries: Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And they are as a group, certainly an ethnic group or indigenous group called the Sami. But across the range, they have very, very different interests as well. And so we have to keep that in mind. So some indigenous groups, for example, fishers and hunters who are perhaps seeing their livelihoods in crisis, do want some sort of development on their territory, whether it's mining or processing, even if it's industrial fisheries, things like that. But of course, what they would like is to see it done environmentally, in an environmentally friendly way or in a sustainable way. But I think an engagement with resource development, whether it's fishing or something harder like mining, these are the things that indigenous populations want to see. Other indigenous peoples, let me just perhaps single them out. Reindeer herders, for example, don't want to see any of that kind of development on their territory because they need it for the reindeer to graze. So it's very, very different across the board. So those are the kinds of things that we'll be learning over the next 2.5 years with this project, is to do some of those deep interviews with indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples, because they have a great interest in the north as well. Right. So.
What about sort of inherently environmentally friendly industries? Well, maybe not inherently, but less nasty. Tourism, I suppose, service industries.
Yeah.
Financial industries.
You mean
Iceland went down that path. A lot of emphasis on tourism, banking,
yes,
insurance. So the banking didn't work out, but not necessarily because there's anything inherently wrong with banking. But are there visions of trying to promote the enrichment of the far north through these environmentally friendly groups?
Definitely, whether you're talking about indigenous communities or non-indigenous communities, the lead player in developing tourism in the Nordic countries and also compared with Russia is Finland. They have industrial, if one could call it industrial tourism in their high north, in their Arctic. So that means thousands of tourists coming in. So they actually have charter flights coming from Tel Aviv, for example, or from London, or from Paris. And if you've ever been to Finland, it's really flat, in fact. They have no mountains to speak of, or unlike Norway, which is quite mountainous. And so skiing is a major, it could be a major industry. But Finland, because it's so entrepreneurial, has actually made a skiing industry in its high north. And so they bring in plane loads of people from France.
Cross-country skiing?
No,
Oh,
downhill.
skiing. Oh, interesting.
Even though they have very little hills. And this is a really interesting phenomenon, and it's actually an example that Sweden, Norway, and Russia are looking to in terms of developing this, what is called a renewable industry in the north. So those are the kinds of things that these countries are looking at, and also indigenous populations in terms of bringing in ecotourism and the like. So those are quite attractive.
And the uptake, I guess, is quite significant in Europe. It's drawing a lot of people from Europe.
And Asia.
And Asia.
Asia is a new market. Typically, the Japanese tourism has been there for a while, but now it's plane loads coming from China.
Right.
Literally, plane loads.
Interesting.
So, yeah, and so they've realized, or Finland especially, has been wooing China for 2 or 3 years now. They've been going to China to advertise themselves, and they've been inviting Chinese delegates to come and look at what they have in northern Finland.
Is China now a major investor?
It's a major investor in the tourism industry, in getting people over from China, but not so much yet in mining or anything like that. There's in fact a tourism office in Rovaniemi in the middle of Finland that caters only to Chinese tourism, and there's also one that caters only to Singapore tourism, and so with Singaporeese employees, and so it's very robust in Finland. Not so much in Norway or Sweden yet. It's still mom and pop operations, camping sites and things like that. So
that's very interesting. I had no idea. We'll be back one more time with Eileen Espiritu. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So I'd like to wind up talking about the governance questions and what's working, what's not working, what's needed. But before I do that, I actually have a sort of a personal interest. One of my first encounters with this range of environmental issues in Scandinavia was back during the Chernobyl accident, because the winds, of course, carried a lot of the fallout to the north, where it was dumped and stayed. And then as you know, and as you mentioned in one of our breaks, Russia's far north is a nuclear wasteland in some respects. So how much of the environmental consciousness, the environmental sensibility in the far north is related to things nuclear, and does that have an impact on people's attitude towards, for example, nuclear power, which some people would say is actually one of the greener energy generation technologies?
Well, in Norway in particular, it has an impact. Not so much Finland. They're still going ahead with the building of 2 or 3 nuclear power plants, despite the accident in Japan. But for Norwegians, it's two-pronged. One is, of course, the Chernobyl experience, because what happened was a lot, as you said, the fallout was in the north, in all of the Nordic countries, and it affected indigenous territories, populations, reindeer herders the most. In Norway, there were months and months where the state kept measuring becquerels in the reindeer meat, and they had to keep throwing out thousands and thousands of kilograms. And this was major for the Sami reindeer herders, because they depended on that as their livelihood. Thankfully, they live in a social welfare system, and so they none of them starved to death or anything. The Norwegian state supported them, but it was a tragic event for Sami reindeer herders, because that's their tradition. And so for this thing from outside that you couldn't see affecting their livelihood, it was acutely devastating for many Sami families. In fact, I think many Sami reindeer herders left the industry or left that practice because of that, because it was too volatile. And there was at least a couple of years there where reindeer meat was not being eaten in Norway. And people were afraid of it for a very long time, and things like that, although of course the testing standards in Norway are very high. The other thing that Norway is engaged in terms of nuclear decommissioning or denuclearifying, if one could say that, the high north. And this actually comes out of Gorbachev's Murmansk speech when he said he wanted a demilitarized nuclear-free zone in the Arctic. Norway immediately jumped on that, and what they did after that and throughout the 90s and even today was to fund the decommissioning of nuclear lighthouses in the north, and I think that's now complete. But it was only completed in the last 2 or 3 years, if that. And then the other one is the decommissioning of nuclear submarines, which are still there. They're sitting in salt water, and so there's of course this corrosion, and so that's a major concern, because as I've told you, Kirkenes, where I live or where I work, is only 14 kilometers from the Russian border, and the port itself is only can be between 100 and 250 kilometers away, which is not far when you're thinking nuclear fallout or whatever emissions. Yes, but it's actually a cooperation with Norway, the U.S., and Germany to decommission these nuclear submarines. And what the Germans had done just in the last few years, well, the last 10 years, was they funded a platform where they could lift up these submarines so that you don't have them sitting in salt water, and then they will dismantle them in that process. But it's a long process.
So the Arctic is a very vulnerable place. It's ecologically sensitive. It's highly interconnected. It sounds as though it's the sort of place that would need a lot of good governance to manage environmental, economic, social, various other issues.
Yes.
How well governed is it? What do we have that's working well in terms of Arctic governance generally, and what do we need?
That's a really good question. Of course, from the Norwegian point of view, what's happened since 1991, since the fall of the Union, is that they've very, very successfully established bilateral cooperation with Russia on many things, such as decommissioning of nuclear submarines, trying to clean up the environment around, especially the borderlands, although that has had limited success because many of these industries are so-called privately owned by an oligarch, so that's been a little bit difficult. But apart from that, of course, there was the establishment of the Arctic Council in 1996. And so through that fora, I think all of the Arctic states can then work together in order to solve some of the imminent problems in the Arctic, such as environmental pollution, climate change. Even though it's been happening for a long time, we sort of came aware of it very, very recently, it seems, because it's only now that we were starting to talk about it in terms of how to mitigate it, things like that. So I'm hoping that the Arctic Council it can be a forum for that, but as you know, it's not a decision-making body. It's not a political body. But I think in terms of soft power, it's important. It's important for indigenous populations. It's important, I think, especially if you have the big powers like Russia and the U.S. at the table together. It's much more important to have a soft kind of dialogue rather than always talking about hard military issues, for example. And so I think as a governing body for the Arctic, or at least a governance body where they can talk about issues and the possible policies for the Arctic, I think that's probably the best we can do at the moment.
And very soon there'll be a decision about granting permanent observer status to some East Asian countries.
Yes, that's right.
Is that something that is generally welcomed in Norway and other?
It is in Norway, yes, and I think it's even in Russia. I think that there's a realization that that they should be included, not only because they're affected by what goes on in the Arctic, whether that's climate change, ice melt and things like that. But there's also great interest coming from Asia, East Asia in particular, in terms of resource development, shipping through Arctic waters, whether that's the Northwest Passage in northern Canada or the Northern Sea Route in northern Russia. And so it's best to have them at the table rather than to exclude them from the table, because obviously they're going to find other ways of voicing their interest in the Arctic, and what a better place than the Arctic Council, where it can be very, very transparent. So,
well, very good. A fascinating set of interacting issues. Thanks for coming in and helping us understand them better. And thanks to the audience for joining us. And join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
Now I am Canadian, and my research has been on indigenous populations in Russia and the impact of industrial development on their communities and on their lives. And so having now moved to Norway, what I've been doing is taking that experience and taking that knowledge and using that as a framework for looking at indigenous populations in northern Norway, but also non-indigenous communities, because unlike the Canadian North, the Norwegian North is both indigenous and non-indigenous. I live on the 70th parallel, and we have universities and colleges up there, and most of the people who live in the Norwegian North are non-indigenous. But there's definitely a strong indigenous element as well.
What's the proportion between indigenous and non-indigenous?
That's a really good question.
To talk about some important issue of global governance, international public policy, international affairs. And today, my guest is Eileen Espiritu, who's director of the Barents Institute at the University of Tromsø in northern Norway. So
Yes.
Welcome for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Arctic sustainability, two topics that are dear to Canadians' hearts, and it'll be interesting to hear what you have to teach us about these from your perspective in northern Norway, which of course is much further north than most of Canadians. We tend to forget that although Canada is an Arctic country, most Canadians live very far south compared to where you live. Let's begin a bit with some background on you and also on the Barents Institute, which I imagine most of our viewers don't know a great deal about yet.
Yes, although I'm living in Norway, parallel, and so we have two research foci. And the first is borders and border issues, and that's very salient at the moment in an expanding EU. So what we're doing is comparative studies of borderlands from the Barents region all the way to the Mediterranean. And there are aspects of northernness or nordicity in that context, but the other research foci that we do, is the Arctic. High North is what it's called in the Norwegian political scene, because as you might know, Norway goes even further north in Svalbard, so that's what is called the real Arctic, the high Arctic in Norway, whereas on the 70th parallel, we're just high north.
I see.
So,
You have a background also in Russian studies.
that's right,
Comparative.
yes.
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Eileen Espiritu on Arctic sustainability. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studio here at the Center for International Governance Innovation.
I think it's just like the Canadian scene. It's about, at least in the larger context of Norway, because it's a little bit bigger.
But relatively evenly split, actually up in the far north, I guess.
Yeah. Well, no.
No, still maintains the same proportion?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think it's because much like the Canadian North, a lot of indigenous, or at least the provincial north in Canada, a lot of indigenous populations or peoples are moving to the south to go to school, to work, and things like that. And it's the same in Norway.
Right.
So you see a large Sami population living in Oslo in the south, whereas they've come from the north.
And what's the mandate of the Barents Institute?
We have two. We are located 14 kilometers from the Russian border, again on the 70th